Assalamu alaikum, dear students. How's it going? I'm okay. I'm back again. In this lesson, I'll repeat my second video lesson that I uploaded earlier, which was on changing assertive negative sentences from active to passive. Okay, as usual, before I start my presentation, I have to move out of your sight till the end of the presentation so that you can have a better view of the monitor and can read everything on the screen clearly. Is that okay? Thank you. At the very outset of the lesson, let's see what benefits you can get from this lesson. Alright, by the end of the lesson, you'll be able to change assertive negative sentences from active to passive. And you will also be able to use the negative words not and never both in an active and in a passive sentence, in the present and in the past indefinite tenses. Dear students, you know that in English, a sentence becomes negative when there is a negative word in it. And the most commonly used negative word in English is this one. However, this negative word never comes alone in a sentence. It is never ever used with the main verb. It is always used with an auxiliary. It always comes with an auxiliary in a sentence. But what auxiliary you can use with it depends on the number and person of the subject and also on the tense it is used in. For example, in the present indefinite tense, the auxiliary that you can use with it must be either do or does. Okay, when the subject is a third person singular subject, the auxiliary that can be used with the negative word not is does. But if the subject is the first person pronoun I or the second person pronoun you, or if the subject is a plural subject, the auxiliary that goes with the negative word not is do. After the auxiliary comes this negative word, and then the verb, the main verb, comes in its basic bare infinitive form. Dear students, remember which auxiliary you use, that doesn't matter. You may use do or you may use does, but whatever auxiliary you use, the main verb must be in its basic form. Okay, now if we change this negative verb phrase from active to passive, we cannot use either of these auxiliaries, do or does, in the passive voice. I repeat, do or does is never ever repeated in the passive voice. Instead, we use a right form of the be verb. The auxiliaries do or does is transformed into a right form of the be verb in the passive voice. So in the present indefinite tense, the right form of the be verb must be either am or is or are. And after this right form of the be verb comes the negative word not, and then as a rule the main verb comes in its past participle form. Okay, now let's see what auxiliary we can use with this negative word not in the past indefinite tense. In the past indefinite tense, the only auxiliary that you can use with this negative word is this one, did. After the auxiliary comes the negative word, and again the main verb comes in its basic bare infinitive form. So you see, dear students, every time we use do, does or did as the auxiliary, the main verbs are always in the basic form, in the bare infinitive form. We cannot add s, es or anything with the main verb when the auxiliaries are do, does or did. Anyway, now if we change this past negative verb phrase from active to passive, we again cannot use the auxiliary did in the passive voice. We have to transform this auxiliary did into a right form of the be verb. We have to use a right form of the be verb instead of the auxiliary did in the passive voice. And the right form of the be verb in the passive voice must be either was or were, depending on the number and person of the subject, and then we use the negative word not, and the verb, main verb, is always in the past participle form in the passive voice. Now dear students, let's use these verb structures in examples. Okay, In the present indefinite tense, an active sentence has a subject which is the agent, and after the subject we need an auxiliary for the negative word not to be used in the sentence. And for a third person singular subject like this in the present indefinite tense, the auxiliary must be this one, and then comes the negative word not. You can contract this negative word not with its auxiliary and it becomes doesn't. But remember, contractions are used only in informal English. In a formal written or oral English, in formal dialogues or in a formal writing, you should not use contractions. Contractions are discouraged in formal English. Okay. After the negative word not comes the main verb in its basic form. Now, dear students, you must have noticed that although the subject is a third person singular subject and the tense is present indefinite tense, the main verb here is without s, es or is with it because of this auxiliary here. You have already learned that when we use do, does or did as the auxiliary, the main verbs are always in its basic form. Right, after the main verb comes the object, and finally we can add an extra phrase to give an extra meaning to the sentence. Now let's try to change this sentence into passive. The passive sentence needs a subject, and the subject of the passive sentence is always the object of the active sentence. The teachers is the subject of the passive sentence, and after the subject of the passive sentence you need a be verb in its right form for the negative word not. Now the right form of the be verb for a plural subject like this in the present indefinite tense is always this one, and after the right form of the be verb you use the negative word not, and then the main verb comes in its past participle form. And after the main verb you use by plus agent. The agent of the active voice becomes the object of the passive voice, and the phrase after the object in the active sentence is used after the object of the passive sentence too. So dear students, now let's move on to see another example in the past indefinite tense. Okay, in the past indefinite tense, in the active voice, after the subject we need an auxiliary, and by now you know that in the past indefinite tense the only auxiliary that can be used is this one, and after did we use not, the negative word, and after that the main verb again comes in its basic form. Although the tense is past indefinite tense, the main verb is in the basic form because of the auxiliary did. Okay, after the main verb comes the object, and then we can use an adverb to add extra meaning to the sentence. Now let's change this active negative sentence into passive. Right, the object of the active sentence becomes the subject of the passive sentence, and then we need an auxiliary for the negative word not. And again, you know, we cannot repeat the auxiliary of the active voice did in the passive. We cannot use did in the passive. We have to change did into a right form of the be verb after the subject of the passive voice. And for a plural subject like this one, some questions, the right form of the be verb is always where? In the past indefinite tense when the subject is plural. After the be verb we use the negative word not, and then the main verb comes in its past participle form as usual, and then we use the by plus agent, the object of the passive voice, and finally the adverb at the end of the active voice remains at the end of the passive voice. And I've already told you, dear students, that you can always use by plus agent at the end of your passive sentence. That's absolutely fair, nothing wrong with that. Okay, all right, dear students, now let's see how we can use the other negative word never in English sentences. Dear students, remember, unlike the negative word not, the negative word never is always used directly with the main verb. The negative word never is never used with any auxiliary. The negative word never doesn't require any auxiliary to be used in a sentence. So after the subject in the present indefinite tense, the negative word never comes alone, and after the negative word never comes the main verb. And the main verb that comes after the negative word never always agrees with the number and person of the subject and also with the tense it is used in. For example, in the present indefinite tense, if the subject is a third person singular subject, the verb that is used after the negative word never must have s, es or is with it. I repeat, if the subject is a third person singular subject and the tense is present indefinite tense, the main verb after never always takes s, es or is with it. Now let's change this negative verb phrase from active to passive. Right, dear students, although in the active voice there is no auxiliary before the negative word never, in the passive voice you must use a right form of the be verb before you use the negative word never, because we know that there can be no passive sentence without be plus V3 combination. A be verb, a right form of the be verb must always be used in the passive voice. So before you use the negative word never in the passive voice, you have to use a right form of the be verb, and in the present indefinite tense the right form of the be verb is either am or is or are, depending on the number and person of the subject. And after the right form of the be verb we use the negative word never, and as usual the main verb after the negative word never must come in its past participle form because it is passive voice. Alright, dear students, now let's use these verb structures in sentences. Okay, here is an example of an active sentence in the present indefinite tense. Alright, now you can clearly see that the verb after never has s with it because the subject is a third person singular subject, Irfan, and the sentence is in the present indefinite tense. So, well, the structure here agrees with this verb phrase. Okay, so when we change this active sentence into passive, we use the object of the active voice as the subject of the passive voice, and after the subject of the passive voice we need a be verb in its right form before we use the negative word never. And for a singular third person singular subject like this in the present indefinite tense, the right form of the be verb must be this one, and after the right form of the be verb comes the negative word never, and then the main verb comes in its past participle form as a rule. And after the main verb of the passive sentence you use by plus agent, the subject of the active voice becomes the object of the passive voice, and it is always placed after a preposition. And finally, the phrase after the object in the active voice is used after the object of the passive voice. So dear students, you see, in this way, following the basic steps of voice change, we can change any active sentence into passive. Now let's see how we can use the negative word never in the past indefinite tense. Alright, you have already learned that the negative word never comes alone in the sentence and comes after the subject without any auxiliary in the active voice, and after the negative word never the verb, main verb agrees with the number and person of the subject and also with the tense it is used in. So in the active voice in the past indefinite tense, the main verb after the negative word never must always be in the past simple form because it agrees with the tense it is used in. In the past indefinite tense, the main verb must be in the past simple form or past indefinite form. And if we change this negative verb phrase from active to passive, we must first use a right form of the be verb in the passive, okay, and the right form of the be verb in the past indefinite tense must either be was or were. And well, was or were must be chosen depending on the number and person of the subject. When the subject is third person singular, we use was, and when the subject is when the subject is third person singular or the first person pronoun I, we use was, and when the subject is the second person pronoun you or any plural subject, we use were. And after the be verb, right form of the be verb, we use the negative word never, and the main verb is always in the past participle form in the passive voice. Now let's use these verb structures in examples. Okay, Peter never dishonored his teachers. Now you see the verb after never is in the past indefinite tense because the sentence is used in the past indefinite tense and the verb must agree with the tense it is used in. Now let's change this active sentence into passive. The object of the active sentence becomes the subject of the passive sentence, and after the subject we need a be verb in its right form, and in the past indefinite tense for a plural subject like this, the right form of the be verb must be were, and then we use the negative word never and the main verb comes in its past participle form, and finally we use by plus the agent, that is the subject of the active voice. Okay, dear students, these are the basic steps that we follow to change any assertive negative sentence in the present and past indefinite tense from active to passive. Now dear students, let's see what we have learned so far from this lesson. Okay, the first thing that we have learned from this lesson is that the negative word not is never used with the main verb. It is always used with an auxiliary. Well, although there is at least one exception. In British English, the negative word not can be used straight with the main verb when the main verb is have, has or had. We can, in British English, it is possible to say I have not any friend in England, or I have not any money in my bank account. This is possible in British English but not in American English. In fact, we cannot use not with any other verb than the verb to have, even in British English. Okay, so this is the first thing we have learned from this lesson today. Then we have learned that, well, when we use do, does or did in a sentence as auxiliary, the main verb is always used in the basic form. We have also learned do, does or did is never used in a passive sentence. Do, does or did is used only in the active voices, never ever in the passive voice sentences. Okay, in fact we transform do, does or did in a right form of the be verb to be used in the passive voice. Okay, and we have also learned that the other negative word never doesn't require an auxiliary to be used in a sentence. It can be used alone with the main verb. It doesn't require any auxiliary. It doesn't come with any auxiliary in the sentence. It comes alone and it is used with the main verb, not with any auxiliary. Okay, and finally we have learned that the main verb that comes after the negative word never always agrees with the number and person of the subject and also with the tense it is used in. Alright, dear students, these are the things that we have learned from today's lesson. Okay, dear students, that's all about changing assertive negative sentences from active to passive. Thanks for watching. In my next video lesson, I'll come up with interrogative sentences and I'll show you how to change interrogative sentences from active to passive. So long, dear students. Take care. Adios.